A frozen battlefield somewhere in 9th century Scandinavia. The air is thick with the metallic scent of blood and the fog of breath from exhausted warriors. Shields crack. Swords clash. Men scream. And then, emerging from the chaos, comes something different. Something terrifying. A warrior with wild eyes and foam at his lips, bare-chested despite the freezing cold, howling like a beast, biting the edge of his shield until his teeth crack. He charges forward with no regard for his own life, no sense of pain, no fear of death. He fights not as a man, but as something else entirely. Something beyond human. They called him a berserker. And for over 1,000 years, the legend of these warriors has haunted our imagination. But here's the question that historians, scientists, and storytellers have been wrestling with for centuries: did berserkers really exist? And if they did, what made them fight that way? This isn't just a question about Vikings or ancient warfare. It's a question about the human mind, about what we're capable of when pushed to the edge, and about the thin line between myth and reality. Because the berserkers weren't just warriors. They were a phenomenon. They were men who, according to the sagas, could enter a trance so deep that they became unstoppable on the battlefield. They were said to be immune to pain, to fire, to iron itself. They fought with the strength of bears and the fury of wolves. And when the battle was over, they would collapse, drained of all energy, sometimes sleeping for days. The very word we use today, going berserk, comes from these men. It's become part of our language, a way to describe someone who's lost control, who's crossed over into madness. But where did this legend come from? And more importantly, is there any truth to it? The earliest accounts we have of berserkers come from Icelandic sagas and Norse poetry, written down centuries after the Viking Age had ended. One of the most famous descriptions appears in the Ynglinga saga, penned by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. He wrote about warriors who served the god Odin, men who rushed into battle without armor, who were as mad as dogs or wolves, who bit their shields and were strong as bears or wild oxen. They killed people with a single blow, Snorri claimed, and neither fire nor iron could harm them. It's a striking image, almost superhuman. But here's where things get complicated. Snorri was writing about events that happened 300 or 400 years before his time. He was recording oral traditions, stories passed down through generations, stories that had likely been embellished, exaggerated, shaped by myth and memory. So the question becomes, how much of what he wrote was real, and how much was legend? Modern historians and archaeologists have been digging into this mystery for decades, and what they've found is fascinating. On one hand, there's virtually no direct archaeological evidence of berserkers. You won't find bones with labels saying this was a berserker or artifacts that definitively prove these warriors existed as described. But that doesn't mean they didn't exist at all. What archaeologists have found are clues, fragments of a larger picture. There are artifacts depicting warriors associated with bears and wolves, animals that held deep spiritual significance in Norse culture. There are references in multiple independent sources, not just Icelandic sagas but also in Germanic and Anglo-Saxon texts, suggesting that some kind of warrior tradition involving altered states of consciousness was real. And perhaps most tellingly, there are biological and psychological explanations that make the berserker phenomenon not only possible but probable. Let's start with the physical descriptions. According to the sagas, berserkers would go through a transformation before battle. They would begin to shiver and get the chills, their teeth would chatter, and then their faces would turn red and swollen. After that, the rage would set in. They would howl, bite their shields, and throw themselves into combat with reckless abandon. To modern readers, this might sound like pure fantasy. But to scientists who study the human stress response, it sounds like something else entirely. It sounds like a massive adrenaline dump combined with a state of dissociation, a psychological condition where the mind disconnects from the body to cope with extreme stress or trauma. Warriors throughout history, from samurai to modern soldiers, have reported entering similar states during combat. Time seems to slow down. Pain becomes distant. Fear evaporates. The body operates on instinct, moving faster and hitting harder than seems humanly possible. In extreme cases, soldiers have reported feeling invincible, continuing to fight even after sustaining serious wounds they didn't feel until the battle was over. This isn't magic. This is the human nervous system pushed to its absolute limit. But there's another layer to the berserker mystery, one that involves substances. For years, scholars have debated whether berserkers use drugs or alcohol to induce their battle trance. The most popular theory has been that they consumed a mushroom called Amanita muscaria, also known as fly agaric, a red-capped mushroom with white spots that grows throughout Scandinavia. This mushroom contains psychoactive compounds that can cause hallucinations, feelings of superhuman strength, and a disconnection from reality. It's a tempting explanation. But here's the problem. Amanita muscaria also causes severe nausea, loss of coordination, and confusion. Not exactly ideal conditions for a warrior who needs to be effective in combat. More recent research has cast doubt on the mushroom theory, with many historians now believing it was a later addition to the legend, something people invented to explain the inexplicable. Other theories have suggested alcohol, herbal mixtures, or even cannabis, but again, these substances tend to impair rather than enhance combat ability. The evidence just doesn't add up. So if it wasn't drugs, what was it? The answer might lie in something even more powerful than any substance, the human mind itself. Throughout history, cultures around the world have developed techniques to induce altered states of consciousness without using drugs. Shamans use rhythmic drumming and dancing. Monks use meditation and fasting. Warriors in various traditions use breath control and mental conditioning. The Vikings, we know, practiced rituals before battle. They had weapon dances, ceremonial movements designed to prepare warriors mentally and spiritually for combat. They believed in the power of Odin, the god of war and frenzy, and many berserkers were said to be his chosen warriors, men who dedicated their lives to serving him. This wasn't just religious belief. This was psychological conditioning, a way of programming the mind to override its natural fear response and access a state of pure, focused aggression. Combined with sleep deprivation, fasting, exposure to extreme cold or heat, and the intense social pressure to prove oneself as a warrior, it's entirely possible that some Viking fighters could have trained themselves to enter a genuine trance state. There's another factor we need to consider, the power of belief itself. If you grow up in a culture where everyone believes that certain warriors can channel the power of gods and animals, where stories of invincible berserkers are told around every fire, where entering this state is seen as the highest honor a warrior can achieve, then the psychological priming is already there. Modern psychology has shown us that belief can have profound effects on the body. The placebo effect can reduce pain and speed healing. Hypnosis can alter perception and even suppress pain. People who believe they're capable of extraordinary feats often surprise themselves with what they can accomplish. Now imagine a young Viking warrior, raised on tales of berserkers, trained from childhood in combat, deeply devoted to Odin, and desperate to prove his worth. Put him in the chaos of battle, where death is everywhere and survival depends on split-second decisions. Give him the cultural framework to interpret his fear and adrenaline rush as divine possession, as the moment when the god enters his body. And suddenly, the impossible becomes possible. He doesn't just fight. He transforms. But here's where the story gets darker, and where we see another side of the Berserker legend. Not all the accounts are heroic. In fact, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia and the Viking Age came to an end, the image of berserkers began to change. They were no longer portrayed as elite warriors or noble champions. Instead, they became villains in the sagas, dangerous criminals who terrorized communities, men who couldn't control their rage and would attack innocent people once the battle trance took hold. Some stories describe berserkers as little more than thugs, warriors for hire who would rampage through villages, raping and murdering without restraint. This shift tells us something important. It suggests that even in Viking society, there was an understanding that the berserker state was dangerous, unstable, something that could turn a warrior into a monster. The Christian chroniclers who wrote many of the later sagas had their own reasons for demonizing pagan warrior traditions, but the concern about uncontrolled violence seems to have been real. A warrior who genuinely couldn't distinguish friend from foe in battle, who might attack his own comrades in a blind rage, wasn't just frightening to enemies. He was frightening to everyone. So where does this leave us? Did berserkers really exist? The honest answer is, probably yes, but not exactly as the legends describe them. The archaeological evidence is thin, and many of the most dramatic claims in the sagas are clearly exaggerated or symbolic rather than literal. No warrior was actually immune to fire and iron. No human being has the strength of a bear or the speed of a wolf. But underneath the mythology, there seems to be a real phenomenon. There were Viking warriors who developed techniques, whether through intense psychological conditioning, cultural rituals, or perhaps a combination of both, to enter an altered state of consciousness in battle. They may have experienced what psychologists call Berserkergang, a genuine dissociative state where the normal limits of fear, pain, and self-preservation temporarily disappear. They may have fought with seemingly impossible courage and endurance, not because they were superhuman, but because they had trained their minds to access the furthest extremes of human capability. And yes, they probably terrified everyone who faced them, because there's something deeply unsettling about a warrior who doesn't fight like he wants to win, but like he's already dead. The legend of the berserkers endures because it touches something primal in us. It asks what we would do if we could let go of all restraint, all fear, all the civilized parts of ourselves that hold us back. It explores the question of how far the human mind and body can be pushed before they break, or before they transcend into something else. And it reminds us that history is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be. The Vikings weren't just raiders and traders and explorers. They were people with complex beliefs, with spiritual practices we're still trying to understand, with psychological techniques that modern science is only now beginning to appreciate. The Berserkers may have been myth, but they were a myth built on something real, on the experiences of warriors who genuinely believed they could become more than human. Today, we use the word berserk casually, to describe anyone who's lost their temper or acted irrationally. But the original Berserkers were something far more intentional, far more disciplined in their madness. They were men who chose to cross a line that most people never approach, who trained themselves to access a state of consciousness that was as dangerous to themselves as it was to their enemies. Whether they succeeded through psychological conditioning, through belief, through ritual, or through some combination we may never fully understand, they left a mark on history that's still visible 1,000 years later. They became legend. And like all the best legends, they force us to ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves, about what humans are capable of when we strip away the thin veneer of civilization and stare into the raw, untamed fury that lies beneath. The Berserkers may be gone, but the question they represent remains: how far would you go if you believed the gods were watching, if honor meant more than life, and if the only way to survive was to become something other than yourself? That's the legacy of the Berserkers. Not the shield biting or the bare shirts or the immunity to weapons. But the idea that transformation is possible, that humans contain multitudes, and that sometimes, the line between warrior and beast is thinner than we'd like to admit.